I was born in Middlesbrough and spent my formative years there, and I left Middlesbrough to work in London in 1969, and eventually after work in Europe I came back to Middlesbrough to work. I've took a keen interest in the history of Middlesbrough, so that's what I'd like to talk about today. Prior to 1825, Middlesbrough consisted of a farmhouse on the salt marshes down by the river. Part of the building of the farmhouse was part of the old priory, which had been there for centuries. St Hilda's was part of Whitby Abbey's under their control, and it became a priory in the 12th century, and it lasted right up to the Reformation. After that it became a church under the parish of Acklam, because Middlesbrough didn't have a parish, and it stayed open till about the middle of the 1660s, I think, and it was then demolished. So after that we were left with the farmhouse, and in 1825 the population was about 25 to 30 people. In 1828 the Stockton to Darlington Railway came into being, and all the coal owners were very interested in deciding whether they could ship coal out of the Tees rather than the Tyne or the Wear, because it was very expensive to ship it out of there. A feasibility study was done to see whether they could move it out of Stockton. And because of the state of the river, which was very marshy, big ships couldn't get up, so they decided to extend the railway to Middlesbrough, and they got an Act of Parliament passed to do that. And Joseph Pease, who was a Quaker from Darlington, bought 500 acres of land at Middlesbrough, including the old farmhouse. So after that things moved pretty quickly. The railway to Middlesbrough was completed in 1830. They put some stays on the river, and they started exporting coal out of Middlesbrough in 1831. That was at the same time as the first house was built. Mr. Pease had plans for 5,000 people to live around the docks area, and West Street was the first housing in Middlesbrough in 1830. The population then blossomed to 150. Now things moved pretty quickly after that. Within 5 years the population had risen to about 5,000. The railway was working well, bringing the coal in, but what they realised was that they could only export the coal at certain tide times. So they decided to build a dock which would give them 24-hour access to the coal and load onto larger ships. This was completed around 1845, and the coal industry blossomed then, exporting out of the Tees. About the same time, iron ore was discovered in the Cleveland Hills, so that was a real boost, and people from the iron mines in Durham and Newcastle, one of them was John Vaughan, who later became Bolko and Vaughan. They set up the first iron mine in Skinning Grove, and that opened in 1850, around there. They then decided to build the first blast furnace on the Tees, and it's near where the transporter is now, in Vulcan Street. And I understand if you go on that site you'll find many of the old furnace bricks, you can pull them out. So that was the first one in 1852. Things moved very rapidly after that. By 1862 there were 40 furnaces along the banks of the Tees. The town had blossomed. Within 5 years there was 5,000 people in the town, which is over the border, around the old town hall, which is still there today, and they had to then decide where they were going to build next. The Ironmasters district, next to the old town, towards Newport, then started to be filled up with loads of new furnaces and ironworks as well. And the new estate on Cannon Street area was then built from the 1860s to the 1880s, and the population of Middlesbrough was booming. I think in 1870 it was about 60,000 then, and by the end of the century it had moved to about 90,000. So it was a really booming place, and whereas other areas of the country had the furnaces shut down, Middlesbrough was booming most of the time. They discovered how to make steel from the Cleveland iron ore, and everything was fine. In 1862 William Gladstone came to Middlesbrough, and he talked about the prospects of the town, and that's where the phrase the infant Hercules came about. So in the early 1900s Dorman Long was one of the biggest players in the in the town. And they had several furnaces. Going up the Tees, which was now, because the iron district was too full, they moved up into Cargafleet, South Bank, Eston. There were furnaces way up the Tees. And they were very ambitious, and eventually from 3,000 employees in 1900, they had 20,000 in 1920. They'd taken over the firms of the Bell brothers, who were at Port Clarence with many furnaces, Samuelson's in the Ironmasters district, and there was one of the other larger firms, which was Bolko and Vaughan. So all those came under Dorman Long. Unfortunately, after the 20s, a big recession set in the country. There was marches to London to give people work. It's 1 in 3 in Middlesbrough were out of work, and that was very well publicised. After that, the war came along, and the ironworks were targets for the German bombers. So Middlesbrough received its fair share of bombers. They weren't as accurate as they thought they were, and a lot of houses, not only in Middlesbrough but in Stockton and Teesside, were destroyed. And at the end of the war, 1,000 people had lost their lives during the war. After the war, Dorman Long decided to build a new complex at Lackenby on the Trunk Road going towards Redcar, with many new factories. And as they came on stream, the older ones on the Iron Masters district, some of them were closing, things were moving on. In 1952, the steel industry was nationalised by the Labour government. The Conservatives got back in shortly afterwards and denationalised it. So there was a lot of upheaval. In the 60s, there was a major steel strike. There was an American, I think, called McGregor, who came in, and after the steel strike was over, there was about half the workforce of the industry was wiped out. So over 100,000 men countrywide had lost their jobs. After that, the industry was denationalised again, and British Steel came about, and that lasted until the 70s. Now, in the meantime, the Ironmasters district had been virtually cleared of the iron works there, and they'd moved further up the river. So things were changing all the time. In the 50s and 60s, it was decided to demolish the Cannon Street area, and the people were moved out to the new estates like Park End, Thorntree, etc. So the area by 1970 had completely changed, and the Cannon Park site was formed, with a few of the older buildings still left, and the church is still there today at the end of Cannon Street, where Cannon Street was. The steel industry still had its ups and downs, but in the 70s, the Redcus blast furnace was built from about 75 to 79. That was at the time the biggest blast furnace in Europe, and Dorman Long, or British Steel, were able to close all the old blast furnaces, so it was referred to as the last man standing. And it was terrific output from that blast furnace. As time moved on, British Steel were privatised with a Dutch company, and Chorus was born. So the blast furnace continued under Chorus. It wasn't successful, and eventually Tata Steel of India bought the remaining steel sites on Teesside. They couldn't make it successful because of the world market. The sale of that blast furnace went to SSI. They had a go at making it successful, but unfortunately, after they'd run it for 3 years, they went into liquidation. They were in difficulties, and in 2015, sadly, the final steel making works on Teesside closed, and despite much effort by local MPs to try and get some funding to mothball the plant, it was unsuccessful. So I'm afraid steel making came to an end in 2015. There are some smaller plants still left in the steel engineering site, which were still owned by Tata. They are now referred to as British Steel. They were bought out by investment company, and they're still going at Lackenby and at a small plant at Skinning Grove in the former iron mine district. So that's where we are with the iron and steel. So Middlesbrough's completely changed from that time.